Good news is we have some internet in the building. During the news break, I walked out to my desk. Yes, it's a long, long walk. Walked out to my desk and I just clicked on a window and it opened up and I did a quick search and an insurance company website popped up and I said, aha. So I walked back here into the studio and said, I'll check my email and see what we've got coming in from people who are tuning in today. And no such luck here in the studio. So I guess it's a partial internet restoration. It's just not restored on the working end of the building. From my perspective, this is the working end of the building. Now, I realize if you're down in accounts payable, you're in the working end of the building from your perspective. If you're in sales, you're in the working end of the building from your perspective. That's generally how that works. For those of us who are on air, and with our massive egos, we believe that the whole business revolves around us. 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We're at 43. The weather is, wow, it's going to be really nice the next couple of days. And then all of a sudden that comes to an end. It is this, the terrible winter we had and what's been a rather damp spring seems to have these tentacles that just it will not easily be removed from our daily lives because the weather is going to be downright crappy over the weekend. I'm telling you, it's going to be rainy and in the mid-40s. It's just that type of miserable weather that just depresses you after you get spoiled by a couple of really nice days, especially if you're at work during the nice days, and then you have the weekend off, and all of a sudden you walk outdoors and you get soaked, and there's a stiff wind, and it's cold, and although, if you've got a good movie to watch, sit down and I guess do that. I wanted to mention the weather is a service of our friends at Mountain Home Auto Ranch. I like to call it the candy store for grown-ups. But we will see some warm weather again by the middle of next week. So only if you're one of those guys or women who've got the weekend off, you'll have a miserable time. But by the time you go back to work in the middle of next week, it'll be nice again while you're in the office, locked away from all the sunshine and warmth. I wanted to mention, speaking of movies, I referenced this in the newspaper column yesterday. Some of you may read that. Um, I highly recommend it in the Times News on Tuesday mornings. But I have a service at home. I got rid of my dish, if you will. I was on DirecTV, and I got rid of it to save some money. And I went ahead and decided to settle on some of these new, they call it cutting the cord, but you got TV, but it's over the internet. I got one of those Alexa Fire Sticks, put it in the side of the television set. And now Alexa, PlayStation View. PlayStation View actually is a television service. Or I'll say, Alexa, Amazon Prime, and Amazon Prime comes up. And I have all of these choices. But at Amazon Prime, sometimes, unlike Netflix, which lists a lot of movies that are available, Amazon Prime gives you a short list, so you can't really tell all the movies that are available. But if you do a title search, you can find out if they've got the movie or not. Generally, I find if it's a movie I'd like to watch, I got to rent it, or I've got to buy it. But if you buy it, you don't actually get the DVD. You buy it, and it's available in your Amazon Prime package. Yeah, okay. But here's the thing. I jokingly said in the column yesterday, if somebody drops an electronic pulse weapon over Nebraska and they take down the electrical grid over much of the country, then I can't watch my Amazon Prime movie because it doesn't really exist. But if I buy a DVD and we have that problem where the electrical grid goes down, I can get a generator and I can still watch the DVD. I don't have to worry about it being lost on somewhere out in the ether with Amazon Prime. So some of the old-fashioned things we have in life are still good. Just like talking about the internet. If that happens, you will have no internet service. And we've been made aware in the last few days here at Town Square Media in Twin Falls how valuable the internet now is to business operations. Not just ours, but to most businesses out there, everything. Megan Blanksma, who got elected last year to the State House of Representatives from Elmore County, she also represents parts of Twin Falls County too. She was telling me at the Twin Falls County Fair last summer that they run a business. They have a farm. She and her husband have a farm in Hammett. And she was explaining that this is one of those situations where in this day and age, you need good internet even on the farm because so much of what you're doing business, you order things now via online. supplies and the like. Even if you're picking them up at the local feed store, you do the order online. So when you go down to the feed store, it's ready for you. You're not, wasting a lot of time while you're waiting for it to be packed up. And so this has been really good for people who are in all sorts of businesses, whether it be agriculture or whether it be banking or whether it be media. We all have these ties. But what if it all suddenly went away? We think about our phones. I no longer have a landline. I was sharing that with a friend of mine last night. She was writing me saying she's switching her email address because her internet provider, which is dropping out of the email business. That was somewhat of a surprise to hear. It's a big provider, I should point out, but it's going to drop its email service. So she's going to find another email service, and she said, so I'll have a new address in a couple of weeks. She said, this is a temporary one. If you want to drop me a line, here's how you can go about doing it. And we're relying on email, and we're relying on, I told her, I wrote back and said, by the way, I have no landline, and I haven't had a landline in years. I just have a cell phone. I do everything by a cell phone now. But if we have an issue where the electrical grid goes down, most people, your cell service isn't going to be very good after the battery dies out. So these are huge concerns we have. This would cripple the U.S. economy. The worst part of this is that if you're on a ventilator and you're in a hospital and that power grid goes down and they don't have a generator, and they may have a generator, but after a couple of weeks, once the gasoline trucks stop coming, sooner or later that generator goes out and your ventilator goes out and then you're dead. And there have been predictions that it will take out a great many of the young people, the babies in this country. It'll take out most of the elderly in this country. There are predictions that the United States population could drop by a third to two-thirds within 2 years of an electromagnetic pulse weapon being dropped over this country and taking down the electrical grid, which, because it grew up organically, it's not one system. There are 500 and some odd utilities providing electricity around the country, and they don't all have matching systems. Rebuilding that would be a Herculean task, and then the manufacturing centers that would rebuild it, you've got to understand, they'd have to find a way to generate their own power in order to rebuild these things. And the big transmission, I don't know what they call them, but you have these various centers around the country where you have big machinery. They don't have a lot of backups available because there's not a lot of call for it. In other words, if we have an issue here where we need a new card in our router at work, they make a lot of those cards out there, and it's just a matter of getting it shipped here and then putting it into the server in the back room, and then the internet will be back. And because there's a huge demand for those. But a lot of these great big transmission centers around the country for electricity, these machines are enormous. So it's not like companies are building them on standby and putting them on shelves somewhere until there's a call for them. Because there's so little call for them, there aren't a lot of people building these transmitters. And so it would be a long time before new ones would come into place. One argument has been, and as I mentioned earlier, U.S. Senator Jim Risch from here in Idaho, he was at a hearing on Capitol Hill, and he was making some statements about this. And he pointed out, he said, I'm on a couple of different committees. One of them is in the Intelligence Committee. And he said, and I do believe, and I'm being briefed by people in intelligence and the military, that the greatest threat to this country's security right now is a terrorist or some rogue state like North Korea taking down our electrical grid. What are we going to do about it? Because the devastating impact it would have on this country would be it would not forever destroy the United States, but it would render us, we might be able to fire off a few nuclear missiles at whatever country did it to us in the beginning. But after a while, you don't even have the wherewithal to fire those things off. And you'd have to do them from the sea, from submarines, because your systems to launch them here in this country might be down for months to years. These are all things that become a serious threat. And it takes away, the only reason I guess the Chinese haven't done it to it is that we still buy a lot of junk from China. I got new glasses the other day. Really happy with my new glasses, but I looked over the frame and it says made in China. If they take us out, they don't have this market. But over time, there are people out there who would say, well, we'll find new markets and the like. How do you protect this electrical grid? Well, you have to have, instead of 500 various grids that really don't talk to each other, you have to have something that's much more interconnected. Although that might mean it's also easier to take down. Well, then you've got to put it underground. And if you drive along the roads, you still notice there's pole after pole after pole after pole. Well, you've got to find a way. If you put that underground, then you protect it from any attack like that, or at least you protect it a lot more of it from any attack like that. How do we go about doing that? Well, we're going to have to spend a lot of money. We're a country that's $20 trillion in debt. And in 10 years, we won't be able to meet most of the obligations that we already have promised people. As I said last week, we call it entitlements, even though nothing in the Constitution says, the founding fathers didn't think about Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. It didn't enter their minds. They didn't think about health insurance and a socialized medicine plan. This is all beyond their scope. But we call them entitlements now, and people increasingly think that they have a right to all of these things. They don't seem to fathom that after a while the well will be dry and we won't be able to afford it. And I mentioned this last week on the show. I said, when that day comes, when just 3 of those programs eat up the entire federal budget and people are sick of paying higher taxes for all of this, we're going to have some soul searching in this country because we can no longer build tanks and fighter planes and ships and submarines. But we also won't be able to afford to protect our electrical grid. You see, we won't be able to do some of those simple things. We won't be able to fill potholes and build new bridges. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. It's coming up on 9:18. We'll squeeze a caller in here before the break. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Good morning, Bill. Good job this morning. Nikola Tesla demonstrated the ability to transmit electricity 50 miles without lines, just through the air. I don't know if his technology is viable or we can improve on it or something like that, but that would get rid of all the big monsters and all the lines and everything else. The only reason that the lines are there is so we can pay for the electricity. Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Tesla, by the way, as I remember hearing a story about him a few years ago, because he had somewhat of a prickly personality. A lot of people didn't want to pick up on his ideas, and he got scorned. I'm told that the old Soviet Union adopted a lot of his ideas, and they went ahead and they have these things available if they need them. I've got to do some more reading on that because I think that's an interesting story, and if it's true, sometimes it doesn't matter if somebody's a jerk. If they've got a good idea, you got to listen to them. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, a short break, and then more of your telephone calls on the way. It's 44. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. And my friends at Waddell & Reed are helping you prepare necessarily for a day that will be, well, it may not be as bad as what I've just portrayed, but they're helping you prepare. They've been doing this since 1937. This is a financial firm, one of the oldest firms in the country to actually offer mutual funds. In fact, Waddell & Reed offers 2 mutual fund families. These are people who know what they're doing, as evidenced by 8 decades in business. They'd like to take a planning approach and take a look at each piece of the puzzle that you have, as well as help you build proper expectations. Waddell & Reed builds plans around your needs and goals. Waddell & Reed will help you manage your money, and at Waddell & Reed, they take planning personally. Bill Colley with you this morning until 10 o'clock. I remember reading a couple of years ago that the ideal-sized community is population 150. I think that's a lot. My mother grew up in a community that size, but I think it's a little small. But it was a belief that that's where there's the most cohesion. I'm going to talk about that in light of what would happen if we went through one of those EMP attacks in just a moment. Coming up on 9:23, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and News Radio 1310.com. We're at 42. I told you the other day that as part of my weight loss program through the Total Body Transformation System, of all things, my neck is 4 inches lower in diameter than it had been just 6 months ago. I noticed that. I put on a shirt to go to a dinner a few weeks back, and I put the dress shirt on, and I couldn't believe how much room I had. It's like my neck was rattling around in the collar. How did I go about doing this? It was through the Total Body Transformation System, developed by a company that's been in business over 20 years with an A+ rating from the Better Business Bureau. And it's backed up by a brilliant scientific team from some of the big universities, research universities, Columbia, Cornell, Tufts. As well as, I wanted to point out, it burns 6 times more fat, and you'll lose 8 times more weight than through normal diet and exercise alone. The meal replacement plan, healthier than many of the meals you're eating. And by the way, the cost is about the same as the meals that you're replacing. You can still have a healthy amount of calories. Now, the average person who's on the total body transformation system will drop 22 pounds in 60 days and lose 4 inches off his or her waist. And I also wanted to point out that if you need to know more, Don Chandler's also been a client of this diet. He lost in excess of 50 pounds. Don is available if you'd like to know more about it at 208-731-3560. He's right here in Twin Falls. Again, the telephone number 731-3560. I was reading that the ideal community would have 150 people. It's just difficult in this world any longer to have communities that size. Although in this part of the country, you have a lot of those communities that aren't very big. I jokingly said on air a couple of weeks ago if I had a place to live. I've been over to Swan Valley a couple of times to visit. Seems to me that that's an ideal community if you're going to go along with that line that 150 people. It's isolated. You'd have to drive some distance to go buy some groceries and some supplies, but realistically, if you only have to do that once every couple of weeks, it's not a big deal. So you can go to Idaho Falls or you can go over toward Jackson or somewhere like that, or go over to Alpine and get your groceries. Could easily be done. And you have a lot of other places in Idaho, really not too far from Twin Falls, that also fit this bill. When we talk about an EMP, that is the electromagnetic pulse weapon, if it were ever to be dropped over this country, and according to U.S. Senator Jim Risch, there's a growing threat. Someone's going to try. It may not succeed, but someone's going to try to attack the electrical grid. Obviously, there are people out there who don't like us, as we've been painfully made aware of over the last 20-some years in this country, going back to the first World Trade Center bombing and then the second attacks that followed up about 8 years after that. I was talking to a friend of mine. He read a book about this and said, actually, from what he was reading, the ideal community would be a community of about a size of 3,000 people. So something like a Kimberly or a Buell, where you'd have an ability to recruit people in your own community who can help each other out. You've got some community centers where you can meet. You've got large spaces. You've got schools that have some big spaces, so you've got a place to go have a meeting, or the fire department has a big meeting room. You'd have that available, and 3,000 people could provide a pretty good common defense. You can man the roads and keep an eye on who comes in and out and do all of those things. And it's still small enough at 3,000 people where you've got that support network. So somebody still knows how to sew. People are willing to trade with you and barter and look out after people who are sick and who are ill. So he said it's about 3,000 people according to a book that he read. So one book says 150, another that he read said 3,000. When you start getting into larger communities, then you're going to have people who are looking to take things from you. It's not as easy to watch who some of those people are. That's what happens when you get to these larger concentrations of population. So a place like Twin Falls might not be the best place to be in this situation. Ideally, there are so many people moving here, though, and we're in that part of the country that's called the Redoubt. Even though it's primarily centered in Montana and northern Idaho, Wyoming and all of Idaho are considered to be part of that. People are coming here because this part of the country offers natural defenses. You're not going to have a lot of people from big cities coming here to see what you've got. They can only drive so far in a tank of gas, and then they're going to run out of gas because there won't be a lot of gas available, and trying to pump it out of the ground because your pumps and all, and in most cases are, they're electric. You won't have the electricity to do that. So if somebody here is living in the barrio in Salt Lake City and decides they're going to come up here and see what you've got that they could take, they might not get very far before they run out of gas, and then they're stuck. So that threat isn't going to necessarily be there. You won't have roving gangs coming out of San Francisco and Los Angeles and Oakland and coming this far for the very same reason. So a friend of mine was writing me a couple of weeks ago, and he was looking at a photograph that I took of a house here in Idaho. And he said, I'm going to tell you what, he said, with all of the canyons you have, he said, you've taken care of one of the critical needs with self-defense. That is, nobody is going to be able to scale a 550-foot canyon to break into your house. If they do, they're wasting their time because they can find an easier place to hit. So you'd have one side of you would have a defensible position, and that nobody's. And I mentioned Alpine, and I also mentioned Swan Valley. If you're in a place like Swan Valley, you've got mountains on both sides of you. You've got a river too, and the river's a pretty good defense. And if you've only got one bridge for going in and out, easily watched, easily monitored. So he was looking around some of the photographs that I go out a lot of weekends and I just take 40 or 50 photographs and I send them to friends of various scenes and sites around Idaho. But he was noting that we have some of the most defensible positions across the country. They don't necessarily have this out on the Great Plains because it's all just wide open. Although you can see people coming. If the corn isn't growing, if you don't have 6 feet of corn, you could see them coming from miles and miles and miles away. But I think that he's raising some great points. You don't have the big urban centers here as a threat, and you've got terrain here that is ideally suited for your own defense. I've got more on this subject coming up in a couple of minutes. We've got a hard break, so I can't take your telephone calls. I'd love to. Got to look at the clock, but if you can be patient, I'll take your calls on the other side in just a few minutes. It's 44. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. I was thinking one place that might not be too bad to be if we ever had the grid go down would be over in Jackpot, Nevada, because there's a great big tower there that you could stay in and put a small perimeter outside, and you've got a nice room, and at least for a couple of weeks there'd probably be food available. Well, then you could go out on the desert and harvest some grouse. 9:34, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. It's 44. Telephone number 736-0300. Despite what is going to be a rainy weekend ahead, at least according to the forecast right now, we will dry out. I mean, obviously, being in the high desert, we're going to dry out as we head towards summer. We get a little closer towards summer, and that means if you were planning on building your dream home, you might start thinking about right now who you're going to talk to about design and the like. And I've been recommending the folks at Western Visions, Inc., because they will sit down and map out this with you. And then once they actually start construction, now they'll do home renovations too of a current existing home or bathroom or kitchen, but they can build from the ground up. And Russell Smith has been in the home building business and renovation business now for decades, and he will consult with you at every step of the process. And you're going to like what you see. He used to build some homes in some resort towns in Colorado that, are to die for. Well, I don't know. Now, you probably wouldn't want to die for it because then, your heirs would be living there and you wouldn't get the use of it. Or if they're like my heirs, they'd probably just sell it so they can go buy some toys they like. But I wanted to point out you can get in touch with Russell. First of all, go to his website and see some examples of some of the fine work they do at Western Visions, Inc. The website is western-visions.com. That's western-visions.com. We have a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on Top Story on KLIX.
Yeah, Bill, that scenario you were laying down about the grid going down, I see that as a glass half full rather than half empty. You get these people out here who say they love their grandchildren and their offspring and all that, yet they're destroying their future by just constantly living off the government with all the Medicare and all the other stuff. They say that they hate socialism, yet they're all card-carrying socialists with Social Security cards. I think they're all hypocrites, and I think it would be helpful to get rid of them.
Well, and we definitely would reduce the population. That's true. That's going to be part of it if it happens. Thanks for the call, 936. He lives by a railroad, we should point out. Maybe they'll still be running. Who knows? 43. I could hear the train in the background. Love the sound of the train whistle. Just don't like sitting at the crossing while I'm waiting for them. You're up next. You're on the air on KLIX. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, you're on the air.
Oh, great. Hey, I'm not really, too into the whole EMP weapon attacks, but I do know enough about electronics and engineering to tell you that there's not going to be people driving cars. All the cars are going to melt just like the electrical generators. All the portable generators, those aren't going to be functioning either. So you're not going to see, I don't want you misleading people on the scope of what this
Ooh, I know. I try to do it every day.
Well, you just, like I said, anyway, I'm not trying to step on your toes or nothing.
Well, do you ever see the movie? It's been 35 years. Did you ever see the movie The Day After?
Yeah.
What happens is you see a character played by Jason Robards. He's driving down the road. The nuclear explosion happens, and his car just stops. It takes it out. because of that pulse.
Absolutely.
But there are going to be people that are going to figure a way around this. And
yeah, you can rewire your alternator. You can respin the coils.
So I'm not wrong.
But it's not going to be instantaneous. There's not going to be raiding parties. Those people that have the capacity to refix their electronics, they're going to be hunkered down. Those are the smart ones.
I hope so. And I'll add to that, I saw a fellow on one of the Survivor shows a couple of years ago, and he's rigged his pickup truck. He put a wood stove in the bed, and his pickup truck is operating off of burning wood. So there are people out there who've already made some, and it's not, he doesn't, I'm going to drive my wood-burning truck down to the store today. Let's go over to Lowe's and see what we can pick up. He's not doing that every day, but he's got it on the farm just in case. Just in case that, and he demonstrated it for the show. He doesn't fire it up too often. But there are people out there who will be ingenious. Yes, mostly they'll be hunkered down, as the caller says. There are going to be people out there, if they discover that you have an ability to do that and you've done it, they'll be looking to take your car or your truck away from you. It's not going to be a pleasant sight out there. So yes, there will be some marauders who are going to find ways to have transportation. Maybe they'll use horses. They're still going to be out there. So the preparation for all of this, I know a few years back, I still kick myself for this. I was, about 5 years ago, I had prepped to the point, you've got to have something that's worth trading. A friend of mine says, for instance, junk silver versus gold. You can't get your gold after something like this happens if it's sitting at a vault in Deutsche Bank in New York City. But if you've got junk silver, you can trade that you can snip it and trade it for various things. I was thinking, I saw these guys on a prepper show, and you know what they were doing? They were non-drinkers. They were teetotalers, but they bought up a liquor store because they knew they could trade the whiskey and the wine to people who would want it after all of this happens. And I figured, well, coffee would be that way too. So I was stuffing. I mean, I had coffee. I could have fueled an army on it. And then I had somebody come along and she said to me, why do you have all this coffee around the house? You need to give this away. And she went down to the food bank and gave it all away. Well, I guess I got a few chits in heaven, I suppose, out of that. It's 9:40. Short break. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. I was thinking about some of the things that likely will not save us in the long run either. And the other day I happened to be driving down Old Route 30, going up through King Hill and out the back way. And so you got this beautiful old historic area with the old Oregon Trail out there, which might attract tourists. It'd be good for Idaho businesses because tourists spend money. And yet you've pockmarked the landscape with all of these wind turbines, these giant pinwheels spinning out there. If you go to our website, I wrote something up about this yesterday, and I included a short video. It's about 30 seconds long. I pulled up beside one of these big towers. And even though it's windy and you can hear some of that wind buffeting my camera, you can still, if you listen closely enough, especially as the wind dies down near the end of this video, you can hear that whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. It's like water torture for the ears. So if you live near one of those things, no wonder it's driving people batty. But we were told that if we put these things in, we'll save the planet. And now you go out there and you go to look at the view and everything else, and all you see are these giant ugly things sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. They don't put wind turbines up near rich people's homes. You notice that? Of course not. They want the power from them that they expect they're going to get, but they're highly inefficient. When Matt Erpelding was on the show the other day, I don't agree with him on a lot, but he made a good point. Solar power, on the other hand, is becoming much more efficient. We will have smaller and smaller arrays for solar, and we'll get more and more power out of it in the future. On the other hand, when Donald Trump said the other day that they were going to finish Keystone XL pipeline, do you realize the operating rigs in North Dakota? I saw this at Say Anything blog yesterday. The number of operating rigs rose 40% in a matter of days. A lot of them had been shuttered and shut down, but because people will go, wait a minute, this guy says he's going to use the resources we already have that we traditionally have been using, and the number of rigs jumped 40%. But the thing is, a lot of these giant pinwheels out there, during a meltdown of the power grid, they're not going to be available either. They're just going to be standing out there looking ugly. And I'll never forget, a friend of mine had been an oil engineer, my buddy Mike Murphy, and Murph had told me one time he was watching. He was at a wedding party, and there was this giant pinwheel that was whipping around just off in the distance. And Murph, having the background in energy, decided to check it out. And he told me later on, he said, they got an electric engine in there because in order to give the public the impression that it's still working on days when the wind isn't blowing, they got to keep that turbine spinning around. So they're using electric power to do it. Well, that won't be available. Those things will just seize up there out on the desert and in various places where they've been set up. I don't always agree with Scott Bedke either, the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Boise, but he told me last summer, I was talking with him at an event, and he told me last summer, if it was his choice, he'd get rid of all of those things. I don't blame him. They're ugly, they're unsightly, and they're inefficient, and they're not going to save us ever when it comes to energy use, and especially if we have a meltdown with a power grid, they're going to be absolutely useless and remain eyesores. We have another caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX at 946.
Hey, I was driving to Boise yesterday, and I saw coming back from Boise, I saw my first solar field. There was like 10 acres of panels, just rows and rows and rows of panels on the side of the interstate between Boise and Mountain Home.
Well, and those things are going to become, they're a better bet than the wind power. Thanks for the call, too. I've heard about that solar farm, but they're a better bet right now than the wind power. Solar, just 10 years ago, I think that the best solar panels that they could develop were they were capturing about 14% of the energy from the sun. Now that's up, I believe now over 20%. And there are predictions that within a few years, they'll be at over 50%. If you can get to 50%, we'll be able to power every building and every electrical device on the planet if we can get there. And the other part of this, the worry had been 10 years ago was that you were going to have to just cover huge swaths of desert to actually get these things to work. But they're getting much better at miniaturization. So they're getting more powerful, they collect more of the energy, and they're getting smaller. So eventually you may be able to buy one of these things, and it may be, 12 inches by 12 inches, set it up outside your house and power everything you've got from here until kingdom come. Though the big concern has been, because in this part of the country, there was the old joke I heard from Bill Hemmer at Fox News a couple of weeks ago, and he was explaining to a guest on the air. He said, "I've got a friend who lives in Sun Valley, Idaho," and he says they haven't had any sun in weeks. We have not had as much sun as we probably normally get around here, but this is an anomaly when it comes to the weather. In this part of the country, you're going to get a lot of sunshine. So the solar panels, they make more sense here than they do in the Great Lakes, where the Great Lakes act as a giant humidor for all of the land nearby. And you get some of the cloudiest parts of the country, just like Seattle is cloudy. But actually, some of those cities in the Great Lakes are actually cloudier than Seattle. So the notion had been, if you build all of these solar farms here in the West, we'll just transmit all of that electricity east to those cloudy cities. Well, it's not that easily done. It's because we talked earlier. The electrical grid is it's 500 different systems. When people were first installing electric lights and they had to put in power companies in all of these various cities, and then they spread out to the local towns and villages, they weren't saying, well, I'm going to connect to this one and connect to that one. A guy came along, and you go around the country, and that's why you hear names, that are regional power companies. And there were, the back east, they've got the Long Island Lighting Company. That was separate from the lighting company in New York City, and they had Consolidated Edison. And these were all in a small geographical area, but they weren't competitors per se, but they were just people who were opening up storefronts and generating power on their own for the local community. It's like having an internet set up where nobody would be able to talk beyond their own, radius of, 50, 60 miles, which would defeat the whole idea of the internet. And that's that ultimate problem with this grid if it does go down. Now, if it was all interconnected and it went down because of a pulse weapon, that in itself would be pretty nasty, which is why Jim Risch and some of his colleagues are saying you got to bury this grid. You might want to think about figuring out ways to integrate the grid, but in the meantime, you've got to bury it. and that means moving all of those transmission lines. Get this, when I mentioned earlier, Idaho has the 50th worst internet service in the country, according to a survey that was done and recently released. The solution that has been proposed, as I mentioned, is that PVC pipe. That'll be underground. They'll run it along highways and streets, and you already have a lot of piping and things, so it's available to be able to put this down there. Well, you may have to put the electrical grid down there too as well. It is going to cost. The whole notion of this, the cost of it is going to be just astronomical. And we get back to two ways of paying for it. Number one, you do it like the railroads did in the early days. The government came in, and I had a guy tell me one time the government should subsidize electric automobiles and all of this because the government historically did that when it built the interstate, and the government did that when it built the railroads. But the government knew that those technologies were going to grow up on their own anyway, organically, if you will. So the government stepped in and said, we'll hasten the process, which will open up the West. We'll give these railroads the right of way. And that's what it worked. It worked spectacularly because this country, the number of railroad miles that we had at the start of the Civil War versus what we had 10 years after the Civil War, it just exploded. And the interstate highway system, while it may have been devastating for some small towns that, Route 66, the famous TV show and songs and everything else about that stretch of road, and now it's just historical artifact. Interstates came along and knocked that out. But what the interstate provided us was that quick moving transportation for truck traffic. You may remember, and I know the younger members of this audience, and there are some out there, but most of the audience here obviously is going to skew a little older because these are types of issues and the like that interest older people, where younger people are out there still banging their head against the wall listening to music. Eisenhower decided that we needed the interstate system because of what he'd seen in Germany with the Autobahn, and realized if we ever got into a big war, you're going to have to move troops around quickly, and rail wasn't going to do all of it. You needed to move heavy equipment around quickly. So the interstate was his reaction to the German Autobahn. And the country used to be able to do big things like that. Well, the country used to send ships to the moon. Try that today. People are going to look around and say, well, I need this. I need a government health. The government's got to pay for my doctor visits. And so we've traded all of those things, big things we used to do. So your options are very limited when it comes to figuring out ways to protect this country and again, from some of those nasty, nasty enemies out there. Telephone number to reach our program today, 736-0300, 736-0300. Bill Cawley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Eisenhower didn't have to deal with $20 trillion in national debt. I don't know that he had much national debt at all. World War II was paid off somewhat quickly. They issued bonds. They didn't borrow a lot of money directly from treasuries around the world. They issued bonds to Americans who were willing to get involved to help with the war effort. But the economy was able to boom because we still had a light tax burden afterwards. And that economy boomed through most of a brief recession after the war, but then through most of the 1950s. And it paid off all of those debts. Caller joining us. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX at 9:54.
Yeah, the last guy that talked about the solar project there out of Boise, I heard Rush talking yesterday, mentioned it, said it's a $4.5 million project, and yet it barely can power a microwave. He didn't have time to talk about it, but I guess he's going to talk about it today, too.
He's specifically referring to the Boise project, then?
Yeah.
I'll have to tune in for that one, too. It will get better. The problem with wind and solar that we've seen over the years, back in the late 1990s, all of these so-called experts were running around the country saying we were going to hit peak oil by 2005 and gasoline would be $10 a gallon. And it frightened a lot of people, even in state governments, not just national government. So they got behind all of these projects thinking we got to have something in place because, people are going to be calling for our heads if gasoline's $10 a gallon. So they all raced out and got involved with these projects late in the last century and early in this century, a lot of these things were planned and they were on the books already back in 2000, and we're seeing them now. But I do believe that from what I've read, solar power will get much more efficient. It's just not there yet. Wind power will never get it more efficient than it currently is, and it's worse than the solar power.
Yeah, you bet.
Hey, thank you much for the telephone call, sir. And again, I was going to give out my email address a little bit more today, but I don't know. I walked out into the outer office and I saw a couple of my coworkers and said, "Is internet back?" And they said yes, and I'm still wondering why it's not back in the studio. It's probably one of those deals where I have to restart the computer to get the internet back. But if I do that, then I can't play commercials and the like during this show and some of those other factors. But I will be checking my email through the day, and I'm actually going to, if I get a chance, I'll just go home and work from home. And hope that what happens, I was mentioning this the other day, I don't know what it is. Between 4 and 6 p.m. in the afternoon, just about every day, my internet starts to wheeze at home. And I've noticed it's more pronounced because I now have internet-based television. So I'll be sitting there and I'll be trying to watch The Five, for instance, on Fox. And all of a sudden it stops. And then it starts. Then it stops. Some days, I was watching Martha McCallum on TV one day. Some days it just drops out for a good 40 minutes. And I don't know if it's a strain on that system. People are coming home from work and they're all firing up the internet. But I'm beginning to find all of this this great technology is fine until you can't use it. We've got to start getting some questions answered from people in this state as to why this service is so bad here. And some are worse than others. I was complaining about the one we use here at the office. Trust me, the one I'm using at home right now is worse than the one here. And it's the alternate. But why don't we get better answers? Why is it that we are 50th in the country? I know that when I first moved here, a guy came by to install cable one at my first apartment and mentioned that he moved here as a refugee from San Francisco and he settled in Kimberly. Not because he wanted to turn this into a liberal bastion either. He came here because he wanted to get away from all of that. But he did tell me, he said, "I'm going to tell you right now, your internet service is about 10 years behind the rest of the country." I didn't give it much thought at the time because all I was doing was checking email on the internet at home and doing some of those things. Why, again, is it 10 years behind everybody else? And I think somebody in government's got some splaining to do when it comes to that. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock. Rush Limbaugh up next, following the news at 10 o'clock from Fox. And again, as the caller said, Rush hopefully will get to explain that situation with a solar farm outside of Boise and just, the lack, so far, the lack of efficiency with it. Sean Hannity after the news at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Glenn Beck at 4, Dave Ramsey tonight. And in the meantime, have a great day. We'll see you in hopefully in 22 hours.